Hi, it's Rob from the Brush and Boltgun. Today I'm going to be doing a quick tutorial on how to paint a Knights of the Chalice Apothecary. If you'd like to support the channel, my Ko-fi and Patreon pages are linked below. Now onto the video.
So this is the finished miniature, what we're going to be working on today and getting from one end of it to the other. So we're going to start off with it sprayed white already, and then by the end you should end up with something similar to this. The first colour is going to be Citadel Mephiston Red. I'm going to be using this to paint up the shoulder pad on this guy. It's going to be Knights of the Chalice. So we'll be painting up this. A couple of the lenses, like there's a bionic eye there. You've got the body on the bottom of the base as well is going to be red. Then you've got all these little jars which will have blood and stuff like that in it. So I'm just going to be using this Mephiston Red for any bits that I think will be looking good in red, like all those little vials. Then once you've got them done, we can move on to the next colour, which is going to be Vallejo Black. So I'm going to be using this to do the helmet of this chap. Now ordinarily it would be white, because he's Knights of the Chalice, I wanted to keep him in line with the rest of the chapter, or the miniatures that I've painted so far. So I'm going to be painting the helmet black on this. We'll be using it on the pistol thing in his left hand. You've also got all those seals between the battle plate and any other little bits that you want to paint up using the black. You can go for that too. Now I'm going to be using Citadel Retributive armour. I'm going to be using this for most of the details. There's a few little winged skulls, and you've got the little apothecary symbol, the name of which I cannot remember. So hopefully someone will sing out in the comments. Doing the tops of all the little vials gold too, because I wanted to make them look as though they were a bit special as they're collecting the gene seed and getting lashed in there. So add a little bit of gold to those too. Next colour, a little bit of Citadel Khorne Red. We are going to use this just to do the wax sections on the purity seals. Got 3 of them across the chest, so we can get them done nice and quick. Now we're using Citadel Recarth Flesh to paint the parchment sections on the purity seals. And there's also a skull strapped to his left hip at the back, so you can give that a decent coat of Rakarth flesh too. I use Citadel Xandri Dust now. This is just to do the little straps, like the leather straps that are holding on those little jars with the gene seed inside. So you can just give them a nice smooth coat of that, and then move on to the next colour. For the belt and pouches, we're now going to use Citadel Baneblade Brown. This is going to be the base for all the kind of leathery colour that we're going to use for the pouches, the holsters and the belt. Now we're going to use some Citadel Mechanicus Standard Grey. I'm just going to use this to do the lenses that he's looking through at the front there. Now I am going to try and do a little bit of funky painting on this. May turn out okay. That's just to get the kind of greyish lens colour going on there, and then we're going to use some greens to represent the lens that he's using to look through it on there too. So we're going to use a little bit of Iron Hand Steel now to paint all these little mechanical arms that are coming out of his back. The idea with those lenses that we painted just a moment ago is that I want them to have that look of having a lens, then with a hint of colour for the bionic eye lens that he's using to look through them, as though you can see a bit of colour coming through that lens. So we'll see how that turns out later on. Hopefully it'll turn out well, but obviously you don't need to do that. You could just do it as a normal lens style. I'll link in the Imperial Night lenses here, because that's the technique that I tend to use. Now I'm going to be using some Citadel Pink Horror, and this is going to be to paint the gene seed that he's holding in his hand there. Next up is Citadel Averland Sunset. Just going to use this to do 2 spots on the underside of that gene seed there, and then you're going to paint up the kind of saw blade. We're going to have a bit of yellow and black striping going on that, and also use this on the eye lenses of both the Apothecary and the Dead Marine on the ground too. We're now going to use a little bit of Vallejo Model Air Chrome. I'm going to use this to do some of the little medical looking parts. So I'm doing the handles on the lamp, and like the teeth on the saw blade, and the little spikes and drill bits. I want to use a nice shinier bit of metallic on those, so we're going to use this chrome on those areas. Also the spikes and the kind of grabber bit on the pistol too, where he's using that to remove the gene seed. I wanted to give them a bit more of a clinical and shiny look to them. That's a little bit of Citadel Mook Green, and this is going to be to do a couple of the eye lenses, and also I'm going to use this to do the little computers on his wrist too, and also the one strapped to his right hip. Now I'm going to use Citadel Apothecary White. Just going to go over all of the white armour, the different areas with this. You notice a lot of it has already been done at the start of the video. That's because I was going to use it for another tutorial, but changed my mind midway through. Next it's Citadel Fugue and Orange shade. I'm going to use this to do all of the yellow sections, so you've got the cover for the saw and the lenses too. Next up, Citadel Drucci Violet. This is going to be used for all of the sections we did with Mephiston Red. You can use this for the Khorne Red as well if you would want to, or you could use Carroberg Crimson for the Khorne Red, whichever you choose. I think I'm just going to be using this for the Mephiston Red on this one. Next up, Citadel Agraxair shade. I'm going to use this to paint all of the gold, and also those leather straps that we used the Zandri dust on earlier on. Going with another Citadel contrast now, Snakebite Leather. We're going to use this to do the 2 holsters, the pouches and the belt as well. Some parts of the belt are a bit tucked away there, so if you're doing it pre-assembled it might be a bit trickier. If you haven't quite built it yet, it might be worth painting these bits before you put the arms on, or certainly the power pack. and that right arm, because it does cover up a few of those little sections of belt, makes it a little bit more awkward, but it's no worries, you can still reach them anyway, it just makes it that little bit more difficult. Now it's Citadel Nolan Oil, we're going to use this on all of the silvery metallics. Citadel Seraphim Sepia next. I'm going to use this to do the parchments and the bone. You can just give them a nice coat of that, and I'll do them nice and quick. Really quick layer now is Citadel Crimson Shade. It's just to do those 3 Khorne Red purity seals and also the gene seed in his hand. I'm going to use Citadel Bieltan Green. This is just to go over all of those sections that we used the Mook Green on. Final kind of shade that we're going to use is just a little bit of Citadel Tesseract Glow. I just wanted to use a little bit of this on this tube here because it looks a bit green and glowy and a little bit funky to use, so I thought I'd have a crack with that. Now we're going to use some Citadel Mephiston Red. I'm going to start reapplying colour to the shoulder pads, to those little jars where the gene seed would go, also to the body on the ground there. What I'll do is I'll link up quite an old video now, I might do a new one of it soon, but how I paint glass jars and vials and things like that, just because it's a really simple method, you can get good results with it, and it's what I'll be doing for these jars and vials on this miniature. Now it's going to be a little bit of Citadel Evil Sunz Scarlet, and we're going to start highlighting this red. So you can see on the shoulder pad I haven't gone all the way down with the Mephiston Red. I've done about 3/4 of it because the shoulder's at an angle, so the part that is underneath wouldn't be getting that much light. So I'm basically thinking about how the light hits the top of the miniature and how that would cause the red to be, so you'd have more shade on the underside of that and lighter colours on the top. So you'll see me working along those lines as we go through. The next colour we're going to use is Citadel Wild Rider Red. I'm going to use this just to do some slight highlights on this, and then use another colour to do edge highlights on the red, just to set them off a little bit. So as I'm going along here I am painting the little vials too. The idea with the vials is doing them so you have the Mephiston Red as the basic area, and then doing almost like you do with the lens, like a curved section to make it look like the light is catching it and making some of it a lighter red than the other areas. As I say, I'll link up that video of painting jars and vials. Next we're going to use a little tiny spot of Trollslayer orange, just to do another little highlight on all the red parts. So just going to use some Vallejo white just to add some light spots to those lenses and the jars we've just done. As I say, there should be a link up to the bottles and jars video somewhere here about how I paint those up. But it's just adding straight lines, either vertically or horizontally, and a few little spots of white just to give them that look that light is catching, so it's catching on glass or something like that, and just giving them a little bit of a shine. Now we're going to start working on the gold using Citadel Retributive armour. Just going to reapply that to all the gold areas. I'm just painting that on the skull with the laurels coming from it, just slightly off camera. But just reapply the gold, leaving the Agraxair shade in the recesses. And keep reapplying that so that you can keep those details showing up with the shade and get that nice rich gold colour back in place. Next up, Citadel Liberator Gold. We're going to use this to highlight the gold that we've just applied. So when you're putting this on, think about where the light's going to be catching it. You're going to be adding it to those areas just to make them have that little bit more shine, that little bit more of a lighter gold colour. Going to add a little bit of Vallejo Model Air Chrome to the Liberator Gold and do little highlights on the edges, like the top edges and the top sort of centre areas of the Liberator Gold that we just put on, just to give them that final little really good shine. That will make all those little details stand out, all those little edges and the ridges and things like that. You see that on the little symbol down the front of his helm there, how much that came to life when we added that colour. I'm just going to use a bit of plain Model Air Chrome just to reapply some of this back to those areas that we shaded earlier, just so we leave the shade in the recesses but pick out some of those details to make them stand out, make them very, very shiny. Now we're going to use Vallejo White once more. We're going to start working on the armour. So what I'm doing here is I'm using the white to do the top surfaces, leaving the undersides and the areas that are kind of hidden away by things shaded with the Apothecary White. And this really is a really good and effective way of doing white armour. It's so easy to do. All you're doing is you're going over the areas that will be catching light with the white and leaving areas that will be slightly shaded with the Apothecary White. Then you get that kind of blend between them, because it really isn't that much of a different colour, but you can see from there how it's got the shade on the underside of the knees and parts of the feet, how much the difference that makes. So we've now gone to Vallejo Black, and this is to go over all the areas of black that we've previously done, just to make sure that there is no other paint colours on them. Now we are using some Vallejo German Grey, and this is to highlight the black. So like we did with the red, you think about where those highlights are and the highlighted areas. You want to be doing the same kind of highlighting with this as you did with the Evil Sunz Scarlet. So if the light's going to be catching it, you want to kind of highlight those areas and colour those with the German Grey, leaving that blackness in the recesses and in the shaded areas. German Grey is dark enough that you can see the highlight without it being too obvious. Finally, for the black, we're going to use some Citadel Mechanica Standard Grey. We're just going to do edge highlights with this on all the edges that be catching the light from above. If there is a large area of black that wouldn't really be catching that much light, you can go over those edges too, just to make those stand out a little bit. That just breaks it up that little bit more. We are now going to use some Citadel Rakarth flesh and start working on his tabard and also the parchments from the purity seals. So we're going to apply these to those areas, leaving the Seraphim Sepia in the recesses, and start building up the colours and lightening those up. We are adding some white to the Rakarth flesh. I'm going to use this as the highlights for it. So you want to leave the shaded areas, and you also want to leave some of the pure Rakarth flesh layer showing. And you want to paint about 50% of those areas with this. So you can see here I'm going on the creases and using the creases as the guide to where I'm putting these lighter shades. And just starting to build the lighter shades up on those. Going to add a little bit more white to the mix now. I'm going to highlight those once more. Again, probably doing about maybe 25% of the previous layer. Something like that, or maybe 50% of the previous layer. Just enough so that you can still see all of the layers of highlights that you're doing on this. There is some nice little creases on the top part, and also where the tabard sort of drops down from that chest armour. You want to just catch those crests on the tabard so that you can see those details without actually having really massive highlights on them. Going to add a little bit more white to the previous mix, and again probably about 50% of the previous layer. We are doing these purity seal parchment bits at the same time as well, using the same colours. Doesn't really matter too much, they don't blend in too much because they've got that red and the gold and the leather colour behind them. Adding a little bit more white now to this previous mix, and we're going to do one more highlight with this. This is mainly just on the very tops of the crests. It is a little bit lighter, a little bit whiter, and we're just going to do some of those just to highlight those edges and get them to stand out that little bit more. Do the skull on the reverse, we are going to use Citadel Ushabti bone and just start highlighting that with those. I'm also doing the handles on the two little medical tools on his front there, so they're made of bone too, just to separate them out so there isn't too much of that kind of Rakarth flesh cloth colour. Didn't want them to blend in too much. So same again as you've done with the rest of it. When you're highlighting the skull, you just want to be picking out the areas that will be catching the light and leaving the other areas in the shade. Now we're going to use some Citadel Screaming Skull just to do the final highlights on that bone. If you don't have Screaming Skull but you do have Ushabti bone, you can just add white to the Ushabti bone and that will work fine, and just as well as using Screaming Skull. Now we're just going to work on the purity seals, so we're going to start back with Khorne Red. We are just going to pick out the details on the purity seals with a little bit of Khorne Red, leaving the Carroburg Crimson in the recesses. I'm going to highlight that with a little bit of Citadel Wazdakka Red, which I'm not showing here just to be helpful. In hindsight, it might have been worth doing these maybe a green colour or something like that, just so they don't blend in quite so much to the jars. But hindsight is a marvellous thing. So we're going to use a little bit of Pink Horror just to do the final highlights on those purity seals. We're also going to use it to do the Gene Seed in his hand there, There's a few little details like a vein running across the top and stuff like that, so you want to make sure that you leave the Carrowbird Crimson in the recesses so that you can see those details. Then we are going to add a tiny little bit of white to the pink horror, and then we are going to highlight those little bits on the gene seed. I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Averland Sunset. I'm going to reapply some of that yellow onto the cover for the saw blade. Nice and blurry there, slightly out of focus. That's how we like to do it. We're also going to do two little spots of Averland Sunset onto the two little bits on the bottom of the gene seed too, and reapply some of the colour to his lens there. Trying to combine quite a few little bits with the same colours in this video, just because there is a lot of layers and a lot of details on this miniature. It does take quite a bit of time to do it. So now we're going to use some Yriel yellow. We're going to do another highlight on the lens there. I'll link up the video of how I do lenses. Basically doing a crescent of colour at the back end of each lens, getting lighter and lighter. Just highlighting that casing on the saw blade too. Finally, we're going to finish with a little bit of Flash Gitz yellow, just to do a few little bits of highlight on there. Don't have to paint the whole thing, just areas where it'd be catching light or areas that you want to have a little bit more brightness to. I'm going to use this to do another bit of highlighting on the lens too. Back to moot green now. We're going to do the same thing that we did with the red earlier on, doing the lenses. Basically picking areas on these screens to highlight so they were kind of C-shape on them. Highlight those edges. I'll link up how to do lenses again here. Add a little bit of white to the moot green. And then we're just going to do some slightly thinner highlights on those areas that we've just put the moot green back onto. Going to add a little bit more white to the previous mix. And again, do thinner highlights once again on those areas. Probably see the size of the brush shrinking as I go down these layers. And finally, we're going to use a little bit of pure white just to do some really fine white highlights. Or in the case of that top one, not so fine. It's just to represent light hitting the screens or the lenses and making them shine. Okay, so we're going to work on those three lenses that he's looking through to see that gene seed. So he's got three of them there. We've painted them with Mechanicus Standard Grey. I'm now going to use a little bit of Citadel Dawnstone to do a crescent on the bottom left hand side of each one. We are then going to use a little bit of Administratum Grey to do a smaller crescent within the Dawnstone one on each of those lenses. Then we are going to use a little bit of white just to do a final highlight in there and put a little spot of light in the top right corner of each lens. That will give them the look of glass and a little bit of reflection, so that when we actually put some gloss varnish on at the end, that will give them a really nice shine. Just going to use a little bit of Nolan Oil, and where we put that final spot on the top right hand corner of those lenses, we will be going round that spot with a bit of Nolan Oil. You can do this before you put the spot on, or you can just blob it on, wait till it dries and put the spot back on if you want to. I'm going to use a little bit of Vallejo Black here while the Nolan Oil dries, and we are just going to do the stripes on the saw blade. We're going to do the scroll work on the purity seals. I'm also going to scroll some writing onto the little scroll on his shoulder too. One of the final things we're going to do is use a little bit of Vallejo Brown to do some highlights on the leather belt and the pouches and the holsters. Now when you're doing the vertical edges, you want to be going horizontal with your brush, and when you're doing the horizontal edges, you want to be going vertical with the brush, and that'll give it that nice rough scuffed edge. Now I haven't done the scuffing as much as I usually do on miniatures. I'm thinking that the medic, he's probably not going to be quite as running around shooting stuff as his battle brothers might be. May well be, but this guy isn't. So I'm not doing quite as much scuffing on his kit. Gonna add a little bit more Rakarth flesh here and do a thinner highlight than the previous one, using the same method so that you get that nice rough edging to the scuffs and the scrapes. We're now going to use a little bit of Citadel Rakarth flesh mixed in with the previous mix to do one final area where we're going to do the final scrapes and scuffs, just doing a little tiny bit in each area where we've previously painted the other scuffs. There's a simple way of doing the lamp on his shoulder and the slightly smaller lamp to the side of his helm there. We are just going to use a little bit of Cassandora yellow shade and just use that to colour each section of those lenses. You can add a little bit of white to the wider areas in the centre if you want to afterwards, but I tend to leave it just like that. Now I'm going to use a tiny little bit of Citadel Tesseract Glow, and where we've been working on these lenses at the front here, I'm just going to use a tiny little bit of that to tint some of those grey areas green, so that as you're looking down those lenses it looks like the green of his bionic eye is looking through those lenses back at you. Now I'm going to use a tiny little bit of Citadel Bieltan Green just to do exactly the same thing but in the darker areas as well. We're also going to tone down some of the brightness in these screens and use this to tone down the darker areas on the lenses. Now we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Screaming Skull, mix a little bit of white into that mix, and we're just going to highlight these medical tools once again. If you can hear any clattering in the background, that is Linnet 2, who is just stumbling across my keyboard and my paintbrushes. Going to add a little bit more white to that previous layer, and then we are going to highlight those for the final part of the video. With that we have the finished Apothecary. Really pleased with how it turned out. It's a great addition to the Knights of the Chalice, and hopefully there were some useful things for you in that video.
Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also, think about subscribing to some of our other social media, link below. Thanks very much.
If you like the channel and you'd like to support me, my Ko-fi and Patreon pages are linked below. Thanks very much.